So welcome to this panel on multi-faith dialogue at the University of Kansas. In this particular panel, we want to wrap up our discussion by looking at what universities should do more with a lot of interesting speakers today. First of all, we'll have Brian Anderson from the Interfaith Youth Corps. He's the program manager there and has worked with many universities in the country to look at interfaith dialogue. And so we're really happy that he could join us. We also have Darryck Dean from Department of Justice, the Community Relations Service. He has done a lot of community work, working with different communities and faith groups to look at faith-based relationship and community participation and reconcile any conflicts there. So his perspective on how faith groups should work together and what should play a role will be really helpful for us to think through these kind of questions. It is important to have a student perspective, given that we want to talk about university roles. And so we have David Tamez. He's a student in philosophy and also has done a lot of faith-related work in the community. And also he hosts the Lawrence Talk in the city of Lawrence, which is a nonprofit organization that tries to bring different groups together to talk about interesting issues facing the community. So glad that we have all these participants in this panel. And I'm going to turn the floor to Brian.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to a rich conversation about the importance of interfaith engagement on our campuses. Alfred has asked me to share a few words about IFYC and some of the trends and engagement that we do within this space. And so looking forward to presenting a few perspectives, but more importantly, really looking forward to having a rich conversation with everyone here on the call. So for my part, I've been with IFYC for about a little over 4 years, where I've come from a background in campus ministry and student life work. And most of my time at IFYC has been engaging with student leadership and creating and crafting programs to push students to think more critically about their interfaith identity, interfaith leadership identity, I should say. And most recently, in my role as a program manager with our grants program, staying in relationship with those campuses that have funding from us to do capacity building at all levels of the campus, from student on up to senior leadership. And so today I'm going to share a little bit more about the context from which we exist at IFYC, and then some of the trends and national engagement that we do, or that we see as well, before opening it up to conversation with everybody. So, so as I said, we'll do a brief context and definition setting, looking at the trends that create opportunities and challenges in our campus environments, and then looking at the pedagogies that we see to be most effective, and some campuses that are really excelling in those arenas. So IFYC, we're about 20 years old. We're based in Chicago, even though we work nationally with all manner of colleges and universities to really foster interfaith cooperation and leadership on those campuses that we're in partnership with. And when we say leadership, we really look at it as something that you do. It's not necessarily a position you hold or something you are, even though those are critical elements of leadership. But really, what are the skills, what are the attitudes that people need to have to be most effective in building interfaith engagement in the spaces and in those areas that they have influence? Where we come from, though, just to take a quick step back, is that we have a long relationship with the Pluralism Project and Professor Diana Eck at Harvard Divinity School. And she tells us that diversity is a fact, and we agree. You look at any group of individuals, and there's a diversity there that's just a representation of the identities and aspects of that space. But what's critical then is, how is there pluralism in the space, and how are the people using the fact of diversity as a means of moving that community forward, of building commitments and relationships so that those in the room are feeling interconnected in a way that brings about change, rather than just saying, great, it's a diverse room, how are we moving forward? And from that, we frame it as religious diversity. And there's 3 elements of religious pluralism that we focus on in our work. So first is the respect for identity. How are people respected for their practices in their worldview tradition that they're coming from? What are the accommodations they need to feel welcomed and appreciated, from prayer and meditative practices to weekly worship, communal worship, to dietary practices as well. Another element is the relationship. How are you building friendships and relationships between the diverse individuals within the community? And how are those relationships moving to a deeper sense of knowledge and appreciative knowledge within the individuals that are involved? And then in return, how is that deepening and opening lines of communication and appreciation for those in the space that this exists within? And finally, what I really like to stress with students is this commitment to the common good. And common good can mean a many number of things. It can be a bit nebulous at times, and changes with the communities that it's a part of. And so the commitment piece is what I really like to stress when working with individuals. And how are we recognizing that we're not always going to find common ground right off the bat? There's going to be spaces where dialogue breaks down. There's going to be spaces where there's kind of a line in the sand that individuals can't cross because of a belief that they hold or an identity that they have. And so instead, how are we committed to working through the barriers, through the challenges, to still maintain a relationship and find common ground where we can, and work towards the common good in however that manifests in the community. And that is something that is challenging, but at IFIC we really believe that when you keep the relationship at the center of the work, then great things can happen. And we've seen it happen, and we'll get to some of those examples in a minute. We recognize, though, that there's a shifting landscape from a religious perspective in the United States, right? That we are the most religiously diverse country and the most devout country in the West, that we have a wealth of belief systems that are showing up in the public space and in civic life, both at the national level as well as at the community and local levels. And so it's not something that can be divorced. It's not an idea that just because I enter a space, I can leave my certain aspects of my identity behind. It comes with me. And so how do we work with that in a community, in a campus community? And part of that shift comes with students moving away from what we know as kind of mainstream Protestant faith traditions, Catholic traditions, and shifting more to, you know, the unaffiliated or quote unquote nuns, and the spiritual but not religious. And with these shifts, how do we then create a space where all still feel welcomed into a conversation? How do we have someone who comes from a long history of devout Catholicism, devout Islamic communities, working alongside individuals that kind of are moving away from that and kind of in a seeking space and not really quite sure where they belong. But in our interfaith work, we invite everyone into that space to allow for a rich dialogue to occur and thrive, ideally. So from that, let's talk a little bit about some trends and challenges and opportunities that we see in the days ahead. And this research and these trends come from our ideals research, which is the Interfaith Diversity Experience and Attitudes Longitudinal Study. It's quite a mouthful, so we like to say ideals. And this is a 4-year survey that we've been doing in partnership with North Carolina State and the Ohio State Universities, which looks at, you know, first year through graduation, how students are growing and changing in their beliefs, attitudes, and experiences in interfaith spaces on a college campus. And we're actually in the final stages. This is year 4 that we're in right now. And we've gotten a wealth of reports and data out of this study that we can speak to at a later time. But suffice to say, there are 3 trends that I want to point to that create opportunities for growth within a college campus. And the first, before I jump into those, I want to say a lot of this all stems from how is a campus welcoming to those individuals. We've found that across the board, on average, 85% of students expect that the campus is going to be welcoming, right? Like they've taken the admissions, they've gotten the admissions letter, they've gotten all the orientation gear, they're coming to campus perceiving like, you know, in general, people are going to like me. They're going to want me to be on this campus. They've accepted me. But when we break that down by different worldview identities, there's a range there. And certain groups are feeling not as welcomed. And so understanding that there's a bit of a guardedness to some student populations is critical to this work. And that means then and translates into a little bit of extra work on the part of faculty, staff, and administrators to say, how are we creating those opportunities to make students feel welcomed and appreciated on this campus, so that then they will feel somewhat safe or encouraged to step into spaces of discomfort to grow and really showcase the tradition that they're coming from. And so 3 areas: provocative encounters, the fact that friendships really do matter, and appreciative knowledge of the traditions around them are what we're seeing as trends coming out of this report at kind of that top level. So let me break those down for you a little bit. So what makes an encounter provocative, right? The term itself can kind of raise some concerns, but it's essentially creating a space for cognitive disequilibrium. So how is it disrupting the automatic thinking that we have and breaking down those assumptions and stereotypes and prejudices that we hold? How are we pushing ourselves, the students, the faculty and staff around us, to step into a space that brings them into new information? How are they recognizing that their way of thinking coming into a college environment is not, is going to be changed? It's going to be pushed in new ways that they may not have been prepared for, but with the right kind of welcoming space, with the right kind of support structures, can really grow into a new positive experience for them. And so coming from a student affairs background, you know, we talk about challenge and support all the time, and kind of that line between discomfort that grows an individual in their identity, and that on the other side of that line, like a fear and a flight kind of mechanism that pushes them back to the communities that they feel safe. And so having the support after a provocative encounter for a student is critical to allow them to process and to reflect more deeply on what they've learned, what they have a chance to grow, and how they have a chance to grow from that experience. So what that can mean is pushing students and motivating students to consider this new and new information and the new perspectives in the communities that they're facing. It's helping make that information accessible and developmentally appropriate. And like I said, there's a line between too much information and just the right amount to kickstart their brain into thinking more critically. And every student needs to be assessed on that. And sometimes that's easier said than done, but for those students that really want to engage, it's having some quick one-on-one checks with them to say, all right, where are you at? What's the identity that you hold? What are the experiences you've already had in your high school experience or your home community that is preparing you for stepping into these spaces now? But really it requires equal part on the students, right? To think about their thinking and to be on a little bit on a meta level. What are they prepared for? What are they ready to challenge and accept in both who they are and what they have in the space that they're stepping into? And so, as again, just to wrap this up, is really think about who is this for? What is provocative for one individual may not be provocative for another. In our national our Interfaith Leadership Institute that we do nationally once a year, we bring students from all over the country. Last year we had 500 folks, a little over 300 students, and then the rest faculty and staff, coming together for a 3-day weekend to train on leadership skills around interfaith engagement. And for some of those folks, they've been before, they're ready to jump straight in and go crazy with dialogue and engagement across lines of difference. And some other folks are a little more guarded and are just testing the waters. And how are we helping all of those individuals feel safe and ready to step into that space of discomfort when some of them may already be in a place of discomfort, whereas others coming from a place of privilege or familiarity are just ready to really engage in that provocativity. And we'll come back to some more in the discussion, I hope, on that front. So friendships matter. Out of this survey, we're also finding that just having a friend of a different worldview tradition elevates the appreciative knowledge and the attitude that we have for people around us. Except in one case where the people that did not have a Hindu friend and then did after a year had a slight dip, and we're still trying to suss that out in the data. But across the board in other spectrums, we are finding that people that are engaging with people around provocative encounters, daily run-ins in both formal settings in the classroom or programs after hours in student activities or campus ministry, but then informally in the cafeteria, in the residence halls, just crossing across campus and bumping into one another and having conversations. It's elevating their attitude of appreciation and acceptance of differing worldviews and pushing people, again, from, like I said, in the provocative encounter, pushing people to think more critically about their own thinking and the diversity around them and how that they want to step into that space of discomfort to challenge their way of thinking and grow as individuals. The friendships, though, they stem from a space of needing a welcoming campus and needing a space for discomfort to be welcomed and safety to be created as they go along. And we found that there are 4 key factors that help close friendships develop and that appreciative attitude then flourish. First is that welcoming college campus. As I mentioned earlier, 85% on average is where people are at when they come to a campus, and it decreases a bit down for certain identities. But everything that a campus can do to create that welcoming environment will spur students to step out of that comfort zone just enough to allow for friendships to take place. And some of that happens in, provocative spaces in the classroom, in those more formal interfaith activities, and then in the informal spaces as well. But there are some things that we're finding that decrease that likelihood of close friendships from happening, and that's in evangelical Protestant institutions where they may have a covenant or have systems in place that decrease someone's willingness to step out of their comfort zone. And then the insensitivity of a campus. So are there policies in place? Are there certain organizations that don't receive the same sort of support or are not getting the same visibility in the online spaces, but also more critically in the student union type spaces and the civic spaces of a college campus? When you walk through the cafeteria or the student center, are there lots of tables and banners and information out about a certain type of worldview and not others? Are there publications coming out from the student newspaper or other spaces that are pushing for more rigid lines of disconnection rather than connection? Those kind of things can impact how likely it is for close friendships to form and also for close friendships to last. And we're looking into that data now to see after that first year, how are those relationships forming and sustaining over the course of the year? Because one factor that also plays into this is how diverse were the communities that the student came from. Are students already coming from a really diverse space and then coming to a campus that is more homogenous, or the other way around is a factor that can also play into this and allowing for the likelihood of a student to want to step into or engage in a provocative encounter. Last but not least, as I said before, appreciative knowledge is critical. And what I didn't say earlier is at IFYC, we're really focused on the lived experiences and the practical side of a faith tradition. We want to know why a Muslim prays 5 times a day. We want to know why a Catholic student will step into a church and put their hand in holy water and make the sign of a cross. There's theological implications, right, of how we live our traditions, where the values come from, and those are very critical, but that is not for us to focus on at IFYC. We want to focus on what that theology plays out in a day-to-day life, and what are the ways that people feel called to their tradition, and what aspects of that tradition are critical to their belief. For example, with myself and another colleague at IFYC, we both identify as Roman Catholic. I'm very focused on the social justice side and the care for the poor, and all of my volunteerism that I did in high school has really formed this sense of action within my Catholic identity. Whereas my coworker, not to say that she doesn't also share similar beliefs in that regard, is very much involved in her church's mass and going once a week and performing prayer and communal life within the Catholic Church physical space in ways that I'm not as connected. And so again, both Catholic, both have the same theological framework that we're coming from, but living out in very different ways. And how that is lived out is what helps find common ground for students in their growth and appreciation for one another. And as mentioned with the friendships and in the provocative spaces, how we create these casual experiences for students to enter into and converse with one another is so critical. And so socializing, studying, dining, having random conversations, or meeting up with friends at a party, these are all spaces where diversity intersects and engagement and pluralism can start to flourish. And when I work with students, especially on how to build a community and mobilize to create a student organization, I really stress that your sphere of influence looks very different than your friend's sphere of influence. And for you to form one friendship gives you an in to a whole wealth of other friendships that you may not have encountered before. And so the more you can make those one-on-one relationships stick and grow, the more likelihood it is for another one to happen and another one after that. So just sorry to speed through some of these things. We'll get to this in discussion, but I just wanted to make note that we do have several ideals reports on our website that dig deeper into some of the concepts from these trends that you're more than welcome to look at as we get to the discussion piece. So in closing, I wanted to just point out a few things that we find to be effective campuses and some pedagogies that they've utilized to make those successful. And first and foremost, we use case studies. So many students are coming to us wanting a real world example to sink their teeth into. And we use real world case studies, and some imaginative pieces, but so often than not, real world cases are so complex and so rich with perspectives that allow students to really imagine themselves in that situation and reflect on, okay, if this is how it happened in this campus, how can I make this work in my campus? How can I relate to a situation that someone else faced, and how can I find a similar solution or potentially a broader solution based from that? Storytelling is also critical. How are we helping students understand their own journey and craft a story and a narrative that helps them relate to others and uncover the interfaith components of their history, even if they don't think there are interfaith components? But also critically looking at, how do we call people to action? How are you inviting people in your community, both fellow students, but also faculty and staff, and peers to step into this pluralistic space with you? And as mentioned before, service learning is a great space to do that, where you're literally getting your hands dirty if it's a community park project. But it's a way to live out the values that you share and find the communal values as you work alongside your peers at a soup kitchen, at a garden, etc. And most importantly, dialogue over debate, right? We want to seek to understand. We don't want to disprove or discredit someone's belief. So often where our beliefs come from, if we don't critically think about it beforehand, we may just say, well, that's just what I believe. And then so how do you debate that critically with somebody? Instead, how are you asking questions that pull out the understanding and again, that appreciative knowledge of how they live their faith, and find that common ground through a shared experience. One of my favorite examples is Lent and Ramadan. Drastically different when you look at it on the outside, but when you sink your teeth into where those belief systems, how they manifest from belief systems and values, there's actually a lot more common ground around prayer, reflection, and meditation of who you are as an individual and atonement that comes out of it. So a couple case studies to wrap up. Our friends at the University of Alabama crafted a series of dialogues around faith and politics. And that term can potentially get some hairs raised on the back of people's necks because we don't often like to talk about faith and politics. But because they crafted a space for 15 of their students from diverse backgrounds to sit together over the course of several weeks, they had a long-term engagement where kind of stereotypes were broken down, real lived stories were elevated, and allowed for the students to see one another as real people. And because of the partnership, both on campus with different centers and within the community, it allowed for a much richer conversation to come forward, and students who wouldn't have necessarily known of one another, right? Because University of Alabama is a massive institution. They were able to bring people together that were living, really close by and thinking, oh, I have nothing in common with a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian. But in reality, there was a lot of rich dialogue that came out of it. And students started realizing how much more that they can gain from their encounters rather than keeping things at a distance. University of Vermont did a similar thing, but through the course of a weekend as a way to kind of gauge what people were thinking of and how further programs could be developed from the engagement. And what I found most powerful about this is that the students themselves are craving this, right? They went on this retreat and they were like, you know what, this is so different than anything else I've ever experienced, but it's what I needed. And so whether you're on a private or a public campus, students are craving these deeper conversations. They're wanting to find deeper meaning and connectivity between their peers. And so whether it's a long-term engagement or a deep, intensive weekend, there are ways to start elevating conversation between students. And in the case of the University of Vermont, once that's elevated, going back to the campus and saying, how can I then create spaces in my personal space, informally, but also formally in the leadership capacity that I have, say in my fraternity or sorority, or in my a knitting club, or any number of groups that they're involved in. How are they then replicating that because of the skills that they gained over the course of a weekend? And then with Northern Colorado, how are you taking simple interfaith engagement activities and deepening them through book readings, through a week of awareness where you bring out the campus to sit at like a job fair type space where faith-based organizations have their table to represent themselves and show and highlight their engagement and common values with everyone in the space. And all three of these highlight one challenge in public institutions is that kind of how do you share across the board, right? How are you not elevating one tradition over another? And if you don't have a campus ministry on your campus, how are you building relationships with community partners that have those worldview traditions that can come onto a campus and support students? How are you situating that within a multicultural center or a student activities space or an academic department because you don't have a campus ministry hub or spiritual life office? Those are all challenges that these campuses have overcome, and I'm happy to dig more into that in our conversation in a moment. But again, just wanted to wrap with, we have a wealth of information at our website, ifyc.org, and I'm more than willing to chat with anyone. If you want to contact me and reach out, happy to chat with you about ways that we can access this information in a more user-friendly way on your campus. But thank you all. Hope that was insightful and look forward to chatting with everyone else in a moment.
Well, thank you, Brian. This is really, really helpful, and you gave us a lot of food for thought.